Thank you so much, and welcome to this webinar. It's a very exciting topic to us, and I hope we'll have great conversations today. And we would like to talk about the data that exists about scholarly communication, and the problem that we highlighted in this webinar description is that unfortunately, most of the data that we have isn't very representative for the global south. And as you can see on the slide that we have three excellent panelists today, Lucy, Caleb, and Ludo. And each one of them will share their perspective on the current status and actions that could be taken to really improve not only access to the data about scholarly communication, but also equitable access and equitable representation and governance issues. I'll be introducing the speakers as they'll be speaking in the order of their speaking, and everyone will have a short up to 10-minute presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for the discussion. So we scheduled 75 minutes for this webinar. Maybe without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker.
Irina, can I just pop in one thing? So it's your questions. If you've got questions, stick them in the chat. Don't wait till the end and put them in, and then we'll field those questions.
Or maybe even Q&A would be better. Because
sorry, is the Q&A, is that,
yeah.
Sorry, apologies,
yeah.
Ignore that, put them in the Q&A, I'm very sorry. And also, just to add to what Irina was saying, one of the things is we only get to see what we can see on various digital platforms, which I think is at the basis of a lot of the inequity that we're seeing as well. So any questions are welcome, thought-provoking as you wish for the speakers or for all of the speakers. Okay, thanks, Irina.
Thank you very much, Katrina. That's why we need two co-chairs. So Lucy Montgomery, Professor Lucy, leads the Innovation in Knowledge Communication Research Program at the Center for Culture and Technology at Curtin University, and she's joining us from Australia. Thank you so much, Lucy, for joining in such an inconvenient time. She's also co-lead of the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative, and that's a major strategic research project exploring how big data can help universities to understand their performance as open knowledge institutions. This open knowledge will be an overarching theme today. And Lucy wrote a lot about open access and open research and open knowledge production. She also has a special interest in China. And you might have read her most recent collaboratively authored book, which is Open Knowledge Institutions Reinventing Universities, which was published by MIT Press. So welcome, Lucy, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Irina. I'll just quickly share my screen. So, first of all, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's always fun to work with Irina and Katrina, and this is a topic which is really close to my heart, and also really, I think, at the heart of a lot of the work that the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative has been focused on, and the type of change that we're trying to create in the world through our research and through the projects and the products that we're developing as a research team. So I suppose that the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative is really focused on thinking about what the scholarly data that surrounds research communication is made up from, what it tells us, who it includes, who it excludes, and also what we might do to change the reality that we're currently working with. So the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative is a major strategic research project that's been funded by Curtin University, and we began work on the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative in 2018 with support from our Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research, Chris Moran. We've been incredibly fortunate so far. I think we've received in total around $6 million in funding internally from Curtin University. And we've also worked with external funders like the Arcadia Fund, and we have projects with the Mellon Foundation and other funders to explore data that's related to research communication. Our project is a little bit unusual in that we're housed inside a Faculty of Humanities at Curtin University. So I am not a scientist. I didn't start life in bibliometrics or scientometrics, but I am collaborating with Professor Cameron Nayland and also with the Curtin Institute for Computation in order to bring critical humanities perspectives to studies of the data that surrounds research and global research communication landscapes. And one of the fantastic things about working in this way means that we're approaching our data sets from a really interdisciplinary perspective, and we are able to combine really serious data science with questions that I think are informed by an awareness of the fact that, for example, the humanities have never been particularly well represented in some of the data sets that are used to map or evaluate research and research communication. I think a lot of us have really firsthand, quite personal experience of what it's like to be invisible within data sets that are being used to shape research policy and which are being used to inform decisions about research investments and research funding. So the byline that we've been using to summarise our mission is that we're seeking to evaluate open knowledge performance, analyse diversity of race, gender and nationality within data sets and within institutions and research landscapes, identify independent metrics of what universities do for and with communities, and we're hoping that we'll be able to ignite new conversations about the relevance of universities to the world in the 21st century. So a really, important difference between the COKI project and commercial data analytics offerings is that COKI is approaching data about scholarly communication from a critical research perspective. So we're a group of researchers based within a university. We've been pulling data together for our own use and because we're interested in understanding research landscapes. And we are conscious of the importance of creating sustainable research infrastructures, but we haven't begun life as a commercial operation or as a business. And we began bringing data together because we wanted to know what data could tell us about what it means for a university to be an open knowledge institution. So we've approached our data sets really with open access, open science, open knowledge, and the openness of research communities right at the front of our thinking. And in the course of our work, we've been thinking quite hard, not just about what's in commercial data sets, as we've compared the data that we're capturing from publicly available sources to the data that we're able to see in commercial data sets. But we're also really interested in what some of the gaps in data sets can tell us about the political economy of global research and research communication landscapes. So, for example, we are really interested in whether or not we can see publications from Africa and Latin America. We have many questions about the extent to which data sets contain information about different research disciplines and whether or not it's safe to be extrapolating, I think, from a few types of publications or a few disciplines to a much more diverse research landscape than might exist in those sort of assumed cases. I'm personally very interested also in different types of publication. So where is the data about books? Is it in our data sets? Are we seeing those as the core research outputs of the humanities and many humanities disciplines? Or are those types of publication just not being included because they're not particularly important to the types of discipline that are really sort of driving forward some of the commercial agendas around bibliometric data? We've also got a lot of questions about grey literature, non-traditional research outputs, policy documents, and other things which, to be honest, are really important in the Centre for Culture and Technology as the types of research output that my colleagues are interested in because, for example, if they're working on critical disability studies, they want to know whether the policy relevant work they're doing is actually being picked up, captured and represented in research evaluation data. Some of the other things that we've been really interested in are whether or not there are communities that might want to be more visible in data sets that are being used to shape research and evaluation policy, as well as whether or not there might be some communities who think that these types of quantitative approaches or the data sets that we're pulling together might actually be something that they really don't want for themselves or their discipline, and the extent to which people who might not want to be included can be kept safely out of some of the data sets that we're exploring. And we're interested in open access publications as one aspect of systems needed to support diversity in access to the benefits of scholarly research, as well as diversity in who has access to the scholarly resources that are needed to participate in processes of science. So a really fundamental question for the COKI project is, can we build an open, transparent, community-governed dataset that places universities and research communities in the driving seat when it comes to understanding what's in the data that's being used to map and evaluate the work they do? And can we as a project help those communities to begin using publicly available data to tell their own stories? So the first thing that we did as a humanities-based research project in 2018, when we sort of set up and we began to think about what we were going to do together and the questions that we wanted to ask, was actually to run a book sprint and to write a manifesto. So this book, which Irina mentioned, is actually a collaboratively authored book that's now been formally published with MIT Press. So it's fully open access. It went through an open peer review process as well as a more traditional peer review process with MIT Press. It's a little bit experimental, and really it was the beginning of a set of questions rather than a more traditional book, which might be reporting on the findings of a project that had reached some kind of conclusion point. So I'm hoping that in a few years we'll have an opportunity to go back and rewrite this book, or to write the part 2 of this book, which I hope will actually be reporting back. And instead of posing a series of questions about how we might support a shift towards open knowledge institutions, would be looking at the practical steps we were able to take as a project and as a community to make that a reality. So one of the benefits of being located at Curtin University, which is a very science and engineering heavy university with quite a strong astrophysics representation and a lot of data scientists, and this very strong capacity in quantitative approaches to working with big data, is that our team has been able to tackle genuinely big data relating to scholarly communication in a way that would have been impossible if we had just been working with humanities-based researchers. So I was told very firmly that it makes no sense to count the type of data that we're linking together and working with. But when we stopped attempting to count the data in our data set about 4 years ago now, at that point we had 12 trillion data points. So we're using cloud-based computing approaches to link together open data sets and to explore the stories that data can tell us about open access and scholarly communication. But in doing that, we're also able to see a huge amount of information that just relates to researchers, to research disciplines, to citation patterns, and to all of the other things that you might expect to find in very large-scale bibliometric data sets. So you can see here in this slice, this is just one slice of our data. We've got information about publications relating to more than 18,000 institutions. And we are capturing data from a range of sources, and we've linked it together in a way that allows us to explore it through different lenses. So, for example, we can explore the profiles of institutions. We can look at the data through the lenses of countries or regions. We can focus on funders, on publishers, on groups, collaborations, and also on diversity in patterns of citation. So what I'm going to do now is very quickly take you, if I can stop sharing my screen and move to another window. I'm going to show you some of the things that we're doing with our data. So I'm hoping, yes, you can see here, this is it's a reasonably cute animation that Cameron Nayland put together for me a little while ago in preparation for a different OASPA talk. And I'm hoping that that one of the moderators will share a link to this animation so that you're able to explore it and to just play with it during the talk. And to think about what some of the patterns in the data you can see might mean. So you can see here that we've actually coded different institutions. Each bubble is an institution, and we've assigned a colour to each one of the institutions that exists in this set. And we can see here gold open access on the left axis and green open access along the bottom. And you can see what's happened with change over time. The slider moves and we can see here changes in the UK in particular, really moving quite strongly along the bottom axis in relation to green, as policy changes in the UK with the REF have really pushed strongly towards requiring open access, and green repositories being a very strong mechanism in the UK context for making research open access. But you can see here with Latin America, something very different is happening. And our guess is that, in fact, this pattern of Latin America moving much more strongly towards gold open access is actually evidence of investments in regional infrastructures that are capable of supporting open access, which appear in our data sets as gold. So I hope that, yeah, I hope that that's helpful for discussion. Just going to make sure that I've shifted screens. Right, so the next thing I just wanted to do is to take you through the COKI Open Access dashboard. The reason I've provided this open access dashboard for you to take a look at is because I think it's a really interesting example, first of all, of some of the pressures that we've been under as a research group. So when we set up the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative, we were being really encouraged very strongly to come up with some kind of ranking around open access and to demonstrate who the top performers are and the top institutions are in relation to open access. And of course, as critical researchers, we don't particularly love rankings. We think they oversimplify things. But we also recognise that the ability to explore and benchmark can be extremely important to some people in some contexts, including when it comes to making decisions that are intended or which do support transparency and accountability within research systems. And that being able to see the data in this way can actually tell us quite a lot about how different, I suppose, funding regimes, legal regimes and approaches might impact on openness and open access. So we've added, we've got 2 tabs. It's a fairly simple dashboard. It often, I think, looks a little bit too simple and people aren't aware that they can click all the way through. But on the country tab, you can see that according to the COKI dataset, which is drawing on cross-ref DOI'd objects, Mali is the world's top performing country when it comes to the proportion of its research that's open. We click in, it's possible to see quite a lot of information about how Mali is making its research open. And we can see how those patterns have changed over time according to the data that we have in our data set. And we can see the platforms where research is being made open. And if we go back to the dashboard, we can do that for every single one of the countries that we have data for in our data set. So it really is a pretty big data set and we can see quite a lot. We can also filter by region. And this, again, we had to put a lot of thought into how we might want to approach filtering. And it's definitely not a perfect system. So some of the questions we get quite often are yes, but you're just comparing countries with very small numbers of publications. So you can see here, French Guiana, we can see 45 publications. They have low numbers of publications, but apparently a very high proportion of open access. However, we can sort of filter that out and say, okay, let's just look at an institution that's showing 1,000 or more publications. We apply that filter, then we get a much smaller number of countries in Oceania. But what we don't see, so if we go back, that this is not apply. Australia's nearest neighbour is actually Indonesia. So Australia is sitting at around 40% open access, which always kind of disappoints and saddens me. And our nearest neighbour, Indonesia, which is producing we can capture quite a significant number of Indonesian publications, and they're sitting at around 81% when it comes to open access. We have the same thing going on over here for an institution, and we can search. So I'm just going to search for my own university, which is Curtin University. And as someone who is located at Curtin University, I know that this data is pretty accurate. We're sitting on around 43% for open access at Curtin. You can see we're sort of limping along. It's not terribly impressive, our shift towards open. But this, when we have a look at this and our librarian at the university takes a look at this, it's not too bad. Everyone thinks it's credible. It's more credible than the data I think occasionally we have access to internally within the university, and we're fairly confident that this data works. And I think that the question I would like to pose to the audience really relates to context and the fact that we're aware that this is not a perfect data set. It's not a perfect dashboard. We only have cross-ref DOI'd objects. We, have many questions about whether or not what we're seeing is reasonably sensible or not. And we would love to have some feedback from users who have played around with this dashboard and explored their own institution's data, because we want to know, is this any good? Is it useful or not? So that's it from me.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And I'll ask a quick question, because when you mentioned gold open access, there was a comment that actually in Latin America, it's diamond. So I just wanted to make sure that when you say gold, you just mean open access via publisher, right?
Yes, that's right. So that's what's appearing as gold in our data sets. So that's what we have labeled as gold. How's that? Open access at the publisher's site.
Clarification. There are also some other questions, but we'll address them in the discussion. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, and he's joining us from Nairobi, Kenya, Caleb Kibet, and he's a bioinformatics researcher at ICIPR. And ICIPR stands for International Center for Insect Psychology and Ecology. And Caleb is a passionate open science advocate and mentor. He's also teaching bioinformatics at Wani University, and he was a Mozilla Open Science Fellow. And he works on a number of very exciting projects, including Open Science Kenya, where he's a co-founder. And over to you, Caleb. How does this scholarly communication data landscape look like from where you are?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Irina. I hope you can see my slide and you can hear me quite well.
Yes.
So, yes, and really, it was really great to listen to Lucy and getting to see some of the platforms that are being introduced to try and increase the feasibility of research output and just understanding of the state of where research is, research output from various organizations and institutions. And I'm quite pleased to speak after her. And I'll just be covering the aspect of increasing feasibility of knowledge, and more particularly from the global south, where I'm based, and more particularly in Africa. So there is this was a slide from Joy Wango, who is really a strong advocate of open science and scholarly communication. And the claim generally, and I think still appears from some of the data that has been shared, is that Africa generates very little research, which might be true to a certain level, but there's also lots of falsehood in that there's very little feasibility of the research, and mainly from the perspective of discoverability. So from the bias that exists to African scholars being inclined to list the Western partners as opposed to their own institutions, especially when you have a dual appointment. Most of the time we have large proportion of data, and especially scholarly output being present in print, and several bottlenecks that do exist, especially with regards to the visibility and the publishing approach, of course. So Africa is rich, but it's highly exploited, especially the concept of helicopter research, which really is more focused on extracting data, extracting information, and therefore the samples and the data collection would be done in Africa, but then the publication would be done from most of the global north countries. And that means that with regards to research output and from Africa, it would definitely be seen as being low. So there's a lot of extractive economy that's affecting so many things from mineral resources, but there's also brain drain and scientific resources. But we're seeing lots of African-driven initiatives that are trying to change the landscape, especially in trying to increase the visibility and providing funding for African research. So there's the Science for Africa Foundation, there's the PASET, which really is a collaboration of African countries bringing in money to support research and PhD and MSc students and postdocs within Africa in science, engineering, and technology. Open Research Africa publishing platforms from Science for Africa. There's the Open Science platform. And there's also our African archive, so the preprint server for mostly of the within Africa, and there's even use of indigenous languages in publishing here. And so we see all these coming up, but nonetheless, there still exists that strong walls of academia, which means that a lot of the work that is being done does not get out of these walls. So you have a lot of work from data being generated, the lab work, experiments and papers and theses that only end up in print and does not get out and become published and becomes an output that is available to the rest of the world and creates that visibility. So there is that need for change. But I want to also just look at this definition of open science from UNESCO, which defines open science as an inclusive construct that combines various movements and practices, aiming to make, and I'm more interested in this concept, multilingual scientific knowledge openly available. So there's the availability, accessibility, and reusability for everyone to increase scientific collaboration and sharing of information for the benefit of science and society, and to open the process of scientific knowledge creation. So knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication to societal actors beyond the traditional scientific community, and that is open science. And looking back at the walls of academia, you can see that lots of the research output, which could be considered to be really the scientific or contribution to research, contribution to science, contribution to scholarly work, is not feasible to most people. So a published article, which is what we always see and what we're trying to measure, is really part of the output, of the knowledge output. And especially within computational space, it's just an advertising, it's not the scholarship. Really, the actual scholarship is that all software environment, the code, the data, and the whole process that produces that result. And there are so many other platforms that are being used to communicate that research output. And therefore, for scholarly communication and modes of scholarly communication should be expanded to capture all these aspects. And when it comes to trying to increase the feasibility of research, the question is who is taking the initiative, who is leading the initiative. And I pose that we really have to consider the context and understand the specific needs. And this intervention should be designed in such a way that they are owned and driven by local communities, and the need for grassroots communities to be involved in that. And there's been quite a bit of initiatives, and this mostly are young people leading initiatives to increase knowledge creation and generation, and more specifically feasibility and open science within Africa. And the process is and should be driven by various communities, and this should come together. So we've seen community collaboration to sensitize and empower the adoption of open practices really being key to increasing that feasibility. So there's so many aspects within it. So we have these various groups, the aspect of open science, but there's also the aspect of within the open life sciences, the need for mentorship and mentoring the grassroots communities to showcase and increase the feasibility of their research within their local communities. Because in the end, it is the grassroots communities that understand what kind of scholarly output and the mode of scholarly output that's available within their space. And they can be able to, one, increase the sharing of the output, but also lead initiatives to try and increase the discoverability of such information. We have groups like the Helix Analytic Africa, where I sit as one of the advisors, that are now trying to increase the discoverability of African research output through the use of persistent identifiers. So the PID Africa Alliance, which is a community of enthusiasts in Africa, so in and from Africa, who are interested in leading the realization of fair sharing. So fair sharing and access to data using persistent identifiers. And this really will unlock lots of the scholarly output that is hidden because they don't have DOIs, they do not have persistent identifiers, they cannot be picked by any of the web scrollers or any of the platforms that are trying to showcase the research output. So really one of the reasons why we see very little output from the African continent is that most of the researchers and researchers who publish in local journals, which might not have the persistent identifiers, they might not be indexed in any of the platforms that are available. And therefore, in as much as the scholarly output might exist, it is not feasible to the rest of the world. So these are really great initiatives that I'm quite keen to see how it will really change the landscape within Africa. So the question is, how can we increase that feasibility of African knowledge and research output? And that aspect of DOIs and persistent identifiers. Then there's the aspect of, if you think about the traditional knowledge dissemination is quite oral, and there's lots of use of stories and songs and dance in dissemination of information. And therefore, if we're thinking of disseminating this information to be of interest to the communities that we serve as researchers, and then we have to use the platforms and the modes that they would understand, that they are used to. And therefore, they just need to facilitate and support publishing in such formats. Digitization of output in libraries, and mainly in print, and that would increase really the discoverability of the output. The use of indigenous languages in publishing for accessibility, in as much as most journals or some journals may allow the information that the information that it is allowed might not be as accessible, and most people may not be aware of that. That they could actually be able to publish using the indigenous languages. Therefore, there's need for that greater sensitization to increase the awareness of such platforms that are available, but also just getting to showcase platforms like the African Archive that are also increasing the publication of using indigenous languages. Then, of course, there's just increase of awareness of the practices, and this would require the leveraging of grassroots communities. On the other hand, when it comes to most of the platforms that are involved in trying to showcase or increase the feasibility of the knowledge that is being generated, there's need to also involve the grassroots communities in co-creation and design to see how this can be tailored to the needs and, of course, adapt to the challenges that exist within those communities. So in the end, really, what I would say is that there's need to change the culture of working in silos, the culture of extractive economy in scholarly research, the culture of correctly judging by the language as opposed to the content, which means that most of the people who do not have English as their first language would shy away from publishing in some of these international journals because of that. So there's lots of change of culture, the culture when it comes to article processing charges and so forth. In the end, really, the change of culture would really lead to an increase in feasibility of some of these research outputs. I thank you for listening to me, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thanks a lot, Caleb. And there are already a lot of questions in the Q&A. You mentioned a number of provocative things, so I'm sure we'll have a great discussion. Now let's listen to Ludo, our next panelist. I don't even know whether I need to introduce Ludo to this audience, but just in case, Ludo Waltman is professor of quantitative science studies at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, which we all probably know by its short name, CWTS. And he is involved in a number of open research projects, and he leads open data initiatives in his research center. So over to you, Ludo.
Thank you, Irina. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. It's great to be here. A topic that we are discussing today that I believe is really of huge importance. Let me share my screen. So what I would like to do is to go through a few things we are working on at my center, at the Center for Science and Technology Studies, Leiden University. I will share with all of you some things that are at the moment things we are quite busy with, things we are putting a lot of effort into. But at the same time, I also want to recognize that the problems we are discussing today, the challenges that we are all facing, really require collaborative solutions. No one on its own, and definitely also not my center, no one on its own will be able to really kind of properly address these difficult challenges. But I hope that CWTF, together with many other organizations, that we can make important progress in this area. So this is something I did a few years ago. I wrote an article together with a few colleagues in which I did something which is actually quite simple in some sense. I compared a few databases that index scholarly articles. You probably know them: Scopus, Web of Science, Dimensions, Crossref, and Microsoft Academic. And Microsoft Academic doesn't exist anymore, as I guess many of you are aware. But at that time it was still in existence. And actually Microsoft Academic was the biggest one. So you can see that here in this figure, we compare the size of the different databases, the number of articles they index, the overlap. And in each time we take Scopus as the baseline, and then we compare Scopus with the other databases. Microsoft Academic is huge compared to Scopus. Crossref is also quite big in comparison with Scopus. Same applies to Dimensions. Web of Science and Scopus are more or less the same size, or similar size. You can also see that all the databases have some unique content. There's of course a lot behind this. There's a lot that can be said about what this figure actually means, what it actually tells us. And I don't have time to go into all these details. But one thing that is behind all of this is the topic that we are discussing today. All kinds of inequities in the way in which scholarly outputs, and in particular also scholarly outputs from different parts of the world, are made visible in databases like the ones that are shown over here. This is a paper by colleagues of mine, colleagues from Canada, who did a similar type of analysis. And they also look at the well-known proprietary commercial databases, Scopus and Web of Science, and they look at what is included, but also what is missing. And they, at that time, they were already very explicitly pointing to the issue of language, and in particular, a content that is not in English being underrepresented in these databases. And that, of course, also relates to some of the things that Caleb mentioned. So here we see indeed some first signals, some first evidence of these databases, in some sense, overemphasizing particular types of scholarly outputs while not giving proper visibility to other types of output, in particular output in certain languages or from particular parts of the world. My colleague, Andre Brazil, who indeed is from Brazil, he looked in more detail at Web of Science and what is indexed in Web of Science, but also what is missing when you look at Brazilian research articles. And he did that by comparing Web of Science with regional databases. Again, I will not go into the details, but this figure which Andre produced, I think really nicely summarizes his findings. So what you see at the bottom is what is missing in Web of Science compared to these other databases. And then you see the disciplines, humanities and social sciences. These are the disciplines where most of the content is actually missing. Most of the Brazilian outputs are missing in Web of Science. And what you also see in this figure, and that you can see that based on the colors, is this is almost only content that is not in English but in Portuguese. So we see again that language plays an important role here. Language plays an important role in what is indexed and what is not indexed in a database like Web of Science. So the conclusion is clear. These databases and analytics derived from these databases, they have a problem in terms of their inclusiveness. There's a lot of content that is missing, and actually that's also specific types of content that are kind of excluded from what is made visible through the analytics that we often produced based on these types of databases. One more example, this is a recent article published in Journal Quantitative Science Studies. It looks at journals that use the OGS system, the Open Journal system for submission, for the editorial workflow, and it analyzes basically the way these journals are or are not indexed in all kinds of databases. So at the bottom you see the geographical distribution of these journals. So many are from Latin America, also India and especially Indonesia are countries with lots of journals that use OGS. But this is important, what you see here. Again, you see all these databases. You see commercial databases, you also see open databases, like for instance, Open Alex. Here in this column, you can see the figures. You can see out of these 25,000 journals that use OGS, 25,000 journals globally that use the system, you can see the number of these journals indexed in these databases. And again, what we see is clear. We see that in the proprietary databases, just a small share of these journals are indexed. That is due to their selectivity. They have all kinds of specific criteria that they apply to decide what they index and what they do not index. The more open databases do a better job. Dimensions, which is kind of open to a certain extent, has a broader coverage, and definitely fully open databases like Open Alex. They provide not a perfect, but at least a much better coverage of these journals. So again, this shows the same thing. We have a problem with many of the databases that we often rely on, and that is a problem that we really need to address. You may, of course, make the counter argument, well, perhaps that research that is not indexed is in some sense less important, less of lower quality, these types of things. My colleague Ismail Rafels, together with a few other colleagues, he looked at that, and indeed they found that perhaps sometimes articles in these journals, in some sense, they serve as training for junior researchers. So perhaps you could make the argument that indeed these articles tend to be in some sense of lower quality. However, he also showed that these articles have other functions. They also fill knowledge gaps. So they actually fill the gaps that the mainstream journals leave. And that's an evidence of these local national journals also playing a really important, crucial role in the scientific system. This is emphasized in all kinds of statements. It's not really new. In the Leiden Manifesto that we published almost 10 years ago, we made kind of these statements. There's the Helsinki Initiative, there's the UNESCO Declaration that Caleb showed. All these declarations kind of make this argument. Now, of course, it's time that we really take action to improve this situation. I'm myself involved in some of this work around openness of metadata, and I know many of you are actually contributing, also many of the publishers participating in this webinar. There are all these initiatives around openness of metadata and new kind of infrastructures that are emerging. This is a partial solution, I would say. So this is one way in which a lot of the data about all these outputs that are produced all over the world can be made available, openly available, and in which we can also build more inclusive, more comprehensive data sources. There's more that needs to be done. So there's also about being able to actually contribute, take part in this whole system. That raises all kinds of questions around equity. So it's good to see that, for instance, Crosshub is taking initiatives to actually make the system more equitable. So lots of important ongoing initiatives there. At my own center, we also try to contribute to this because we believe this is crucial. So in our strategic plan, we have a strong focus on promoting global inclusivity in science, and in particular also in the data sources that we often use. Openness of research information is important, and we want to make a contribution in the coming years to make progress in these important areas. In particular, we have a UNESCO chair on diversity and inclusion in global science. I mentioned Ismail Rafels, one of the people in the chair, but also some other colleagues are contributing. And this is where we hope to work together with like-minded organizations to push for progress in this area. In particular, one of the aims of the UNESCO chair is to foster the development of more inclusive scholarly communication, including, of course, all the data sources around the scholarly communication system. And that also raises questions about the things we do ourselves. At CWTS, we built a Leiden ranking, which is a university ranking based on Web of Science data. So this is a ranking that is based on data sources that are not inclusive, as we have seen, globally inclusive. And that's a problem. So they face problems in terms of inclusiveness, also in terms of openness. We recognize that. So this is actually where we fail to meet our own kind of criteria for what we feel is a responsible way of producing these types of analytics. So this is also where we need to do better. For us also, for CWTS, the question now is, how can we do it? How can we do better? How can we also work together with other organizations? I mentioned a few here on this slide. Also COKI, so Lucy's initiative is one of those. How can we do better to also make our own platforms, tools, analytics more inclusive and more open? So there's a lot of work to be done there. Thank you for your attention, and I really hope we can work together to realize fully open and inclusive scholarly communication data. Thank you.
Handing over to my colleague Katrina for the second part of the discussion. And I guess the question is also, how do we build scholarly communication systems in a way that they are really multilingual, they are locally run and maintained, and metadata from them is really captured by this global discovery systems.
Yeah, thank you. Irina, stay on, because we can tag team with questions and things. But I think all three speakers have beautifully showed us that there's so much missing what we can see, whether it's language. And actually to speak to that, there's a couple of questions on the chat. There's lots of really interesting questions, but in terms, there's a question here about what can journal publishers do to increase the visibility of research from Africa. So here we have an audience with a lot of publishers in it. So what can we actually do? And a related question is also was directed at just specifically at Lucy, but again could be for everyone, is how can we ensure transparency in the infrastructure itself, the research infrastructure? And I think that these questions are both tied in. So maybe perhaps if I go first to Caleb, if you could get Caleb, if you could come on screen as well. What would you want journal publishers to do to increase the visibility of research from Africa in particular?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a really good answer to that, but I will attempt, because it is a difficult question, because the aspect is, are African researchers attempting, or scholars attempting to publish in these journals to begin with? And what are the barriers when it comes to facilitating them to publish in these journals? Because most of the time, if someone tries to publish in a journal and they receive a rejection, and the rejection is not usually because of the quality of the research that they have done, but rather language that they've used, or get a desk rejection because you're not really well known, we're not sure who you are, and therefore that would reduce even the attempt to try and publish in these journals. So the aspect is get to provide some avenues to, okay, this is a really good article, but it may require some language support, and provide that support in language editing to those that may have English as their second language, and therefore it would ease the access to the international journals when it comes to publish, and of course increase the visibility of the scholarly contribution that come from Africa. And therefore I think it's trying to reduce the barriers that already exist when it comes to their ability to publish in these journals. And of course the other aspect would be greater visibility or awareness that these journals do exist and they can actually publish in these journals. Some of them may actually only be aware of their local journals, or are used to publishing in their local institutional and university journals, and therefore getting to know that some other international journals exist that focus on their specific domain are in existence, then they would be able to facilitate that. I would say that for now.
Yeah, so there's 2 points there. One is education, raising awareness, both for researchers in Africa that they can publish in these journals, but also ensuring that publishers make it more possible for researchers from Africa to publish, to be more welcoming, to be more supportive in terms of language editing and that sort of thing. I think so. And so, Lucy, I don't know how related this is in terms of the sort of infrastructure question, but it's sort of linked. I'll let you go and see if it's a connected question or not, and then we can come back to the incentives, Caleb, which I think was what you were really speaking to as much as anything.
Right. So sorry, I'm not sure if I was using the Q&A correctly. So apologies to everyone. I actually pushed buttons and wasn't sure what they were doing, but this is a live, so I now know what that means. And I think, you know, one of the things we've been really blown away by with the data we're working with is that it is transparent. We have made decisions about how we've handled data. We understand what's more or less in our data sets, where our data is coming from, and we've been able to show very clearly how we've made those decisions. And actually, we can provide the data to anyone who would like to come in and explore it. So I think that in terms of how we can ensure greater transparency in our infrastructures, openness is now really technically possible. It's you know, it's really not that hard to keep data sets open. And I think we also need to really reduce barriers to engaging with data in meaningful ways, including by creating tools that are easier to use, by understanding the needs of different communities who might want to come in and, you know, explore data and make different decisions about how data's combined or how, you know, things are compared within data sets. We have opportunities to actually create user-friendly tools and to ensure that we just are keeping things open so that people can see the data that's being used. They can see how decisions have been made to, you know, to add things up or not, or to include things or exclude things. And I think now it's quite reasonable to say that's our expectation. Having these opaque, closed systems that we can't look at isn't necessary. We don't need it.
Do you think that also applies to the publisher infrastructure as well? Could, you know, in a similar way, very briefly, because and then Irina, I'll let you take over the next question. But just in terms of, you know, in making stuff more visible and transparent about the data they can provide.
Yes, I think good quality metadata. Yes, absolutely. So we can, I guess, it is now possible. We can, you know, run metadata quality checks, and we are already doing that for some of the work we're doing around open access books, where we're able to provide reports back to publishers about the quality of their metadata. And I can't see really why you know, having openness and transparency around providing data quality reports to a wider community, that's technically possible. So I think then it's just a community question about whether or not that's something we want. And if it is something we want, how do we make it sustainable?
Yeah, good question.
Maybe I'll take question about data sources, because it was mentioned a couple of times, and I guess that's to Luda. Have you tested the lens or base search to compare Web of Science to Web of Science and Scopus? Because they have additional functionalities, granular functionalities.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did not mention these data sources, and actually we did not include them in the analysis that I just showed. But that's definitely not because we feel these data sources are not interesting. So Lens is or was traditionally based to a large extent or built on top of Microsoft Academic, and I believe they're now kind of moving to Open Alex as their underlying source of data. they are doing really important, valuable work. There's more initiatives like also Open Air, for instance, doing a lot of important work in this area. And there's actually too much going on to really properly keep track of all of this. And I think that ultimately also shows kind of the point I was trying to make, that we need to find the right way to do this together rather than having too many separate initiatives. So even for us at CWTS and my team, it's difficult for us to really keep up with all the developments in this area.
Okay, so now if I can go back to the sort of incentive structure around the sort of lack of visibility, and Caleb, this is a couple of questions for you. One is how do you see the transformation of visibility of African knowledge and research output influencing and changing the incentive systems? And is there a way in which making it more visible will make, suppose at one level, people evaluate it in a different way, whether within Africa or externally? And the other related question is when it comes to changing cultures, there are usually different strategies for doing that. So you can have local incentives, or there can be sort of top-down government policies or different strategic planning. And so if we want to change the incentive system, what strategies do you think would be the most practical? So I suppose the two questions is the visibility going to change, your growing visibility, change the incentive structure? And then how can we promote the cultural change, and what strategies might be needed to make African research more visible?
Thank you. Those are really great questions and quite pertinent. So I'm not sure if it could be actually the other way around, because if you look at it, the reason why someone would push and focus only on a particular type of scholarly output, so say publishing in this particular high impact factor journals, is because their promotion system within the academic system is dependent on such publications and publishing in high impact factor journals, which may not be open access, and therefore in itself it's reducing the feasibility of the research because now it's not open. But then if there's a change in incentive system more focused on evaluating the whole scope of scholarly contribution, and I say it really, the scholarly contribution is from data collection, community outreach, community engagement, dissemination in different platforms, would be considered teaching, all those aspects, if they were considered, and all these are scholarly contributions, these are knowledge contributions that if someone would not invest in generating them, if they feel that they are not going to contribute to their promotion and so forth. And therefore, it would be the other way around. Changing the incentive system to capture some of these things would really increase the feasibility of the research. When it comes to the culture change, I think that's one of the culture change approaches would be the change of incentive. So that would be from the academic institutions, but then also there would be the change from the funders, whereby one providing funding to facilitate publishing in open access journals, and also pushing for the sharing of knowledge that cuts across, but of course keeping in mind the nuances that exist within those specific communities, of course, personal data protection and so forth, and of course, providing education and facilitating that sharing of the data that they are generating. The other platforms, of course, the other group that would really do great in changing the system would be the publishers themselves. One, for example, when it comes to helicopter research, they should and they could reject an article that uses samples and data and everything from, say, an African or global South, but without any co-author from that place. And therefore, try to increase the capacity building within those the underrepresented organizations, and therefore, when the capacity is increased, that of course the knowledge should be shared more widely. And so many others. The government has a role to play. The policies, if they are not in place, then there's nothing that you can depend on, or nothing that would guide someone when it regards to knowledge sharing. Therefore, there's a role that the government would play. And ultimately, the other group is the young people. They have the interest and the zeal and the ability to change and influence change from the bottom going up. So therefore, this grassroots communities driven by young people would have a great role to play as well.
That's a fascinating and a huge different range of ways that the incentives could change. Do you think there is the willingness among funders and government bodies and institutions across Africa to change the incentive system away from the sort of usual high impact factor, in Western journals, and to take on the context within to make sort of local knowledge more important as well? Do you think there is that appetite there?
Yes, the appetite and the interest is. I've been involved in advocacy and awareness building within various universities, and one of the barriers I've seen is the lack of awareness that the concept of open science, the concept of sharing knowledge that cuts across, there's lack of awareness that that's actually possible. And therefore, we are stuck with what we've been traditionally taught and what we've been traditionally seen that as is that's the pathway, the silos and the walls of academia. We are stuck with that. But getting to increase that awareness and then empowerment. So awareness that this is a pathway that's actually in existence, that would increase the visibility of the work, the impact of your work. It would benefit your community. You can also involve your community in knowledge generation, and you can provide those platforms of videos, songs, and dances, and that can also be a contribution. The co-creation, the citizen science, the awareness that these approaches are also available to them. And then the next step then, of course, would be the empowerment, empowering them to be able to take advantage of the resources, the platforms that are already in existence. So all these things are in existence. The funders are quite willing, and they are, when it comes to writing the grants, if you include that APC charges and all that, it's always accepted, but most of them may not be aware and may not include that in their funding. Of course, there's so many competing
Yes.
aspects for resources, but really, if that is budgeted for from the very beginning, it would really make a change.
And young people are, like everywhere in the world, they're actually at the vanguard. They're at the forefront of trying to push for change. It's more the senior researchers, and really fascinating what you were saying about penalizing helicopter research, and that we could talk about that for a long time. I did recently hear that the Wellcome Trust are specifically funding research in the Global South by only Global South researchers. So there may be a shift in that direction. But really, that was a lovely summary of what's happening. Irina.
Yeah, I think this competition aspect is also interesting and important because I agree that competition is healthy, but maybe this competition shouldn't be happening everywhere. And why do we really need to measure, and what do we really need to measure, and what do we want to compare? Like, do we still need these rankings? Do we still need sure, we need to measure progress, but maybe measuring progress could be measured not only in numbers, but I don't know, maybe some qualitative data. And it would be great to hear from Ludo and Lucy what you think about that. How can we reward community science? And
oops. Ludo, do you have thoughts? You've been quite quiet.
Well, I could perhaps say something, Irina, about the thing that you mentioned in particular, rankings, and kind of, do we actually need them? I think Lucy already expressed some hesitation, and I kind of share that. My feeling, this is of course a very complex question, but my feeling is that clearly we have been overemphasizing for a long time the importance of metrics, of all kinds of quantitative figures to assess performance, and rankings are perhaps the most extreme form of all of that. So we see now a healthy kind of return to a kind of acknowledging also the value of other ways of thinking about how accomplishments of researchers can be recognized, also more value in peer review mechanisms. At the same time, I also feel that things like for instance, rankings, we will need them also in the future, but we should rethink the way we use them. So rather than having these one-size-fits-all solutions that are supposed to tell all of us in the world kind of who is best and who is kind of the top institution, all of that, we need to move towards analytics, dashboards, statistics that actually people can use themselves to tailor them to their specific situation, their specific context. And that, for instance, would enable a university to indeed show how it is ranked, but to do so based on a ranking that makes sense for that university in its specific context, given its specific mission and all of that. And openness of data, open science, that's, I think, a necessary precondition to get there, to make this shift. Lucy, perhaps you have something to add to this.
I think the only other thing I would add is that that supporting confidence around exploring the data is really important. And I know that certainly in our university, and I think in a lot of places, people see numbers and they think, oh, wow, that's a little bit scary, or they're perhaps just not confident about asking questions about what's in the data, where did it come from, how am I compared, what would happen if you change things. So yeah, so I agree with Ludo, and I think now we've got really not just a technical opportunity, but also I think a challenge of saying, well, how do we bring communities with us? How do we create tools that help them to feel confident when they engage with data? How do we make data transparent, but we don't just provide it as some massive dump that you can only get to if you can code and you have access to a Google Cloud instance and you're maybe one of, 3 researchers in your country that can engage with that data. How do we actually make it meaningfully open to different communities so that they can explore it with confidence and use it critically so that it does what they need it to do?
Yeah, and to different countries as well. So you're creating this dashboard based on your sense. Okay, you're getting input, but is it actually creating what?
That's right. So
yeah,
yeah. So we thought, we have tried with that dashboard to, for example, we put quite a lot of effort into ensuring that it works in a low bandwidth setting. And we've thought about how we've extracted the data. So we're making a subset that's relevant of our data available. We've tried hard to make it clear. If you go onto the data tab, you can see how we've made decisions about what's in each of those sections. So I had that great question because I used the word gold, which was of the, actually that was that lovely champagne bubble chart that Cameron made quite a while ago. And we were still just, casually putting in words like green and gold. And when it came to the really serious business of how do we make an accessible dashboard, we've moved to terminology like other platform open or publisher open, and then we've provided information about what we mean by those terms and what's in each of the color sections of the chart. So we've done at our end what we think might work, but getting feedback from there are, I think I counted this morning, not one by one, but I checked, there's more than 7,000 institutions that we claim to have data for in that dashboard. And actually, we have very little way of knowing whether or not the data that we're showing about each of, the institutions that we're representing really makes sense for those institutions, or whether it may be, it really not so much. And unless people actually take a look and start exploring, we have very little way of really knowing, whether what we're doing makes sense. So working on those feedback loops, I think, is really important, and recognizing the limits of our own, networks, I think, is really important.
So I think we're going to have to wrap up here, and I'm going to leave the wrap up to Irina, because unfortunately I have to jump off. Thank you so much, everyone, and to the audience. And I'll look forward to listening to the recording again.
Thanks a lot, Katrina, and thanks a million, Caleb, Lucy, and Luda. It was an excellent discussion. And I hope we'll continue this topic because we plan another webinar focusing on Latin America and also Open Alex, because keeping in mind different time zones, it was really difficult to have everyone at the same time. So thanks a lot to OASPA for running these discussions, and also thank you to the webinar sponsors, Royal Society of Chemistry, TrendMD, and Hindavi. And stay tuned, and thanks a lot for joining and for writing comments and